Welcome to the First Friday Coffee Break with the Community Indicators Consortium. CIC is a central knowledge and organizational hub for community indicators projects, helping to advance and support measurable, equitable, and sustainable improvements in the quality of community life. I am Marty Romiti, Managing Director for CIC, and on the first Friday of each month, we take a short break from our day to learn about the latest projects, data tools, and key issues happening in the world of community indicators. This month, we hear from Claire Gibbons and Jacki Renegar about the successful and long-standing partnership between the Charleston, South Carolina Regional Development Alliance and Charleston Metro Chamber of Commerce in producing their annual Regional Economic Scorecard. The scorecard ranks Charleston against peer cities to evaluate the area's efforts to address economic, talent, livability, and well-being issues. The most recent release of the scorecard emphasizes that more inclusive economies are stronger economies. Thank you again for tuning in to this month's CIC Coffee Break.
Thanks for having us. I'm Claire Gibbons. I head up our global marketing and communications, and I've been with the Alliance over 10 years. So the Regional Economic Scorecard has been a project that I've been a partner on for the past 10 years, and it's been in existence for 11. So it's been a long journey, and it's transitioned. Our role, CRDA's role, is to serve as the economic development agency for the 3-county Charleston Metro in South Carolina. So our mission is to grow long-term economic prosperity for the region to ensure that everyone here has opportunities to thrive. We focus on specific industry clusters. We look at not only business recruitment, but talent attraction, investment attraction, and having a supportive entrepreneurial ecosystem.
And I'm Jacki Renegar. I'm Director of Research and Business Intelligence at CRDA, the Regional Development Alliance in Charleston. And so my fun role is I get to be the resident data geek. I get to assess, compile, interpret, and help put together all of the data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, that helps sell the Charleston region to the rest of the world as a great place to do business, as well as to live, work, and play. And Claire and I work together a lot on that kind of thing.
So the origin story, there really wasn't an issue or something that it was in reaction to. It was basically the need to have a benchmark for measuring our economic performance and for measuring it over time, and also looking at comparative metros. So how is our community progressing over time? How is it stacking up against peer metros across the country? And as our economy evolved, so has the scorecard report. We tend to have economic development strategies for the community every 5 years. So the tool was meant to help assess those strategies. Are we making progress? So our scorecard is benchmarked to 2005. So all the data that you see is benchmarked to that point in time. And as you know, what's measured gets done. And that's really the purpose of the tool. And it is a data tool to help assess the progress or the lack of progress that our community is making and give decision makers the opportunity to see a fact-based report on how we've performed over time.
When we originally started the project a decade ago or more, it was not meant to be a marketing piece when it was originally developed. So it was mostly not meant for outside audiences, customers or an audience that was outside the Charleston metro market. It was meant to be for an audience of public sector and private sector. So when we say the public sector in the Charleston region, I mean both the staff on the various agencies as well as elected officials. And then on the private sector side, companies that have a stake in our region. And to some extent, the audience was for the general population of the Charleston area. We really wanted everybody who has a stake in boosting the prosperity in our region to have the same set of facts and to be singing off kind of the same song sheet, so to speak. So that was how the primary audience was developed. And as the project and our community has matured and progressed, we've learned that it can be an important piece, not so much a marketing piece, but it's important to outside audiences to show that internally as a market, you're measuring not only your strengths, but also your challenges. And then to be able to show that you're actually working together to try to improve on those challenges or improve weaknesses in your community. And that goes a long way and shows a lot of value to people outside the market.
And I would add to that, as a marketer, my lens is always, how can my community put its best foot forward? We tend to choose in marketing messages that are positive, that reinforce, the competitive advantages of the community. And so this report, in some ways, does the opposite of that. I mean, we refer to it as warts and all. It is meant to be a fact-based, data-driven assessment of where we are as a community as a point in time. And when you ask about, the audience and their needs, a lot of it is also education, and education for people who aren't data geeks and researchers who may not understand the connecting of the dots. So one of the things that we looked at, and continue to look at, is how can we simplify the story? How can we help connect the dots that education, education levels, housing affordability, quality of place issues all directly impact and influence economic performance. So when we looked at which indicators to choose, it was very much looking holistically at economic performance and not just the outputs, but the inputs as well.
Each of our personalities on this project, because we work well together, have different perspectives, but both the same goal of showing the good and the bad and how we are tackling the bad as a community. So,
and there have been a lot of partners involved in this project over the 10 years of its life. We started with academic partners. We had a technical committee. We had developed a volunteer-led task force over time, some of which were to advise. Many times it was to help distribute it and make sure that it is getting throughout the community. So the benefit of having over 10 years working together on this is that we continue to evolve, refine, talk about what worked, what could happen better. So at this point, I think it is a well-oiled machine, but we're constantly looking to how do we go good to great? How do we make sure that it's relevant? And so when you ask, how does the scorecard design, how do the audience that we're trying to reach influence it? I think the biggest challenge is simplifying, not overthinking, overproducing the report. And particularly for those lay people who aren't used to understanding the data, I think the first thing I ask myself is, why should someone care? What's in it for them? What's the takeaway? And so if there was a lesson that I had to other communities building this is, first think about your end goal. What is it you're hoping to achieve? And what we have found is that it's not enough just to present the data. People need help and guidance in, okay, what do we do with this information? And while CRDA is not an advocacy organization, we are a public-private partnership. It's a nonprofit. We have partnered over the years with our area's Metro Chamber of Commerce, who is an advocacy organization. So we can have information in there about where we are at this point in time, how we're performing over time, and then give some very specific, tangible to-dos or suggestions that the Metro Chamber provides, and then they can go forth as the lobbyists and talk to county councils, city councils, state and federal delegations that have the public policy implications from what the data is saying.
Well, I'd like to go back to what Claire mentioned about kind of the team that works on each project. It was, as she mentioned in the beginning phases, we had an academic partner, a college or university that added both capacity in tracking and interpreting the data, but also kind of provided that third party credibility when we were, first starting out with the project. Getting buy-in from everybody in the community, it helped to have that academic partner be on our team, collecting the data and helping to present the data. And then over time, as Claire mentioned, the project gained momentum and confidence. The business members in particular and public sector figures in the community started asking us, what's the timeline of this year's scorecard? We're anxious to see what the results were. So we knew that it was becoming a valuable piece of information that community members were looking forward to. And so it kind of had that credibility standpoint. And we found internally we had enough research team to collect a lot of the data on our own. So it wasn't necessary to always have an academic partner. So that's one lesson we did learn as communities might try this project on their own. It doesn't have to have that in place to work. And in addition, Claire mentioned the various committees. We had a technical committee, which was our research team at each of the collaborating organizations, so the Metro Chamber, the Regional Development Alliance, and then also our publishing partner, the Charleston Regional Business Journal, which is another regional agency, but mostly with a business news focus. So they would help us with design as well as disseminating the information to the general population through their publication. But back to the committees internally that worked on the project, we had, so that technical committee would be the research team and the academic partner early on. And then we had the steering committees, which were volunteers that we helped select from the business community, as well as some public sector members who, again, everybody has a stake in boosting the prosperity or the economy in our region. So we wanted everybody to have a seat at the table, to have recommendations on which indicators we chose, which communities we should benchmark ourselves against, and kind of helping us to interpret the story. So while the data or research or technical team might interpret the story, it was good to have the steering committee or the non-researchers to say, what does that really mean to the layperson? Or like Claire mentioned earlier, what does that mean to me? Or what does that mean for my family in this community? And so we had, it helped us tell the story in a non-technical way. And I think that helped make the whole project more successful and seen as a valuable tool. Yeah, one thing we were sure to do is to look at other communities who had already done similar projects and certainly look at the indicators that they used. We did know, however, that each community has its own strengths and weaknesses and its own needs. So we used our technical team and looking at and evaluating those other communities' projects in choosing a lot of indicators that they had also used, but then we made sure to look for indicators that were important to our community. For instance, we are a port city, a metro area, and the Ports Authority in our state is a huge asset to our entire state. So that it was important for us to choose indicators relating to that, just as an example. From a researcher's perspective, it was important to choose indicators that were from sources that you knew were going to continuously put out their annual data. So it had to be a reliable source. You want to be careful not to choose sources that may produce some index or figure or indicator for a year or two, and then for whatever reason, budgetary reason or other, they don't produce that indicator anymore. So we used a lot of federal data sources and sources that had been around for a long time and that were reliable and we knew would be there every year, so that we wouldn't have to, so you'd have consistency and apples to apples in your comparison.
I think one of the challenges in building the report and the story and deciding which indicators to go in, because there are, once you establish it down to the reliable, consistent data, there's still a lot of that. So how do you pick and choose? And a lot of those discussions happen at the technical committee level. And when it comes to connecting the dots for an economy, we really funneled it down to kind of 4 key buckets. We looked at through the lens of human capital or talent. We looked at an entrepreneurial environment. We looked at innovative activity, and we looked at quality of place. And then, of course, the economic outcomes themselves. But all of those things are somewhat interrelated. So there was a lot of discussion because they could cross over multiple buckets as to what made sense as to where it goes. And, with 10 years of scorecards, this is the very first one, 2010. It was 24 pages. There was a lot of exposition and explaining to make sure it was clear. So an executive summary was done as well for the ADD folks in the crowd that aren't going to dive into 24 pages of data. Over the years, we've refined that. We got rid of 2 versions, and we pared down to basically, I think this is 12 pages, including the cover. This is the most recent one. So it's been a learning process. Part of the things that we've looked at is with a data lag, how do you tell the story of what's currently happening and being done when the data hasn't caught up to tell that yet? So we tried to find examples in the community, and this task force was helpful in gathering that information. We also tried to look at, from the comparative peer communities, what are they doing to move the needle on their issues? Because this is meant to be a thought leadership piece. It's helpful to know if our community is facing transportation, infrastructure funding issues. What is Salt Lake City, for example, which is one of our peer communities, doing to move that needle forward? And sometimes it's what is a community not doing well. And I won't name any names on those, but the bad examples are just as informative and illustrative to decision makers as the good examples. So those are some of the things that increase the length over the years. So that's part of where we look to simplify and storytell, is how do you have the right amount of data and pulling things out for the trends of the data, married with some short copy on, what does this mean? What do I do with this? What are examples of other communities that are doing? And that's probably the most that has changed back and forth over the 11 years of doing it. And that's more art than science.
And Claire mentioned the word change, and I mentioned earlier wanting to be consistent from year to year. One other lesson we learned, and she may have alluded to it in earlier comments, was that don't let perfect consistency be your enemy. You want to be able to adapt. Despite every effort to find sources sometimes or indicators that came out year by year, always there, inevitably something would go away for budgetary purposes, especially during the Great Recession. Some things either lagged, didn't fit our timeline, or just flat weren't published. And so we would either have to find a substitute, or anyway, just be prepared to change. Sometimes you have to adapt and substitute in order to keep your product published from year to year. And we learned, looking back, that it actually sometimes improves. So don't be afraid of changing if you need to. Another example of that is I've forgotten if it was about halfway through, but at some point in the middle of the project, or the decade or so we've been doing this, we decided that we had to change the communities that we compared ourselves to, because our market had matured to a certain point where we felt like we were more peer communities with some of the communities we were comparing to, as opposed, or we maybe surpassed or matured beyond comparison to some communities that we originally started with.
And some of them are aspirational communities. I mean, right now, of the 8 that we look at, we are the smallest by population size. The economies and the structural elements of those economies may be similar, but we are, punching outside of our weight class, so to speak. And so it's interesting to see what are the issues and the challenges maybe that more mature economies or larger size metros are facing. And as a mid-sized market, how do we plan for that? How do we adjust for that? Because we are an incredibly fast growing community. And we want this document, as much as the data is sometimes rear facing, to also be forward looking.
Yeah, we looked at it a lot of different ways. We wanted to compare ourselves to geographically other communities that were similar in the Southeast, for example. We are a coastal city, like I mentioned, a coastal metro area. So we wanted to be sure we looked at communities that have either waterways as a physical challenge to infrastructure and that kind of thing, or other coastal communities, or maybe even port cities. Jacksonville is an example, and Seattle is an example of coastal communities that we compare ourselves with. We also looked at economic makeup, so communities that have automotive and aerospace and life sciences and logistics and information technology as key components of their economic makeup. Claire mentioned we look at sizes of the communities, both the population and workforce and that kind of thing. And you won't always find perfect matches, but you just need to think about, when you're evaluating the communities, think about what drives their economy and what makes their economic momentum, what boosts their economy. And if there are similarities to yours, then they might be a good comparator. And even some of the communities we use, like Claire mentioned, are 2 or 3 times the size of our population. So when we're comparing indicators like GDP or gross regional product, we don't just look at the flat dollar figure, we'll do it per capita or per employee or some kind of standardized or normalized process to the data to make it apples to apples comparison.
Well said.
Thank you. Were there other perspectives I missed?
That was great.
Okay. That's another thing is sometimes the every single indicator may not make a big splash in the actual publication. It might be part of an index or the groupings of data that we chose, like human capital. Maybe we feature 2 or 3 indicators that help tell a unique story that particular year. Maybe we just throw a snapshot or an infographic of one of the indicators, but you may not be able to fit it all into the publication, and that's okay. As long as somewhere in there you lay out everything you're using, or footnotes or something to that effect to show how you rolled up all the data to get it into whatever story you're trying to tell.
My overall advice is to keep it simple. Think about, how would you explain this data to an 8th grader? Because that's what news is typically written at as an 8th grade comprehension level. So when I'm talking to Jacki and she's helping me as a layperson understand it, because I have to be able to communicate it to others, I'm asking her various questions. I'm saying, how can I simplify this down, the language down, pare it down, and still keep it accurate? And I think having someone or people on the team who have strong attention to detail, because it's easy to transpose numbers, it's easy to get different indicators confused, and attention to detail isn't something that can be taught, really. So having the right team together of the left and the right brain folks who can work closely together, have strong attention to detail, and the same thing comes into play with your graphic designer, because how do you take numbers and graphs and charts and bring those to life? And that's probably our biggest challenge over the years, is how do you keep it simple, accurate, but also make sure that it's relevant, interesting, and visually compelling. So we keep paring down copy over the years and doing more infographics to make sure that we're really honing in to the key things. So I would say keep it simple. Why should your audience care? what is the goal that you ultimately want to convey with this data report, and don't throw the kitchen sink in there. Less is more.
Yeah, I tend to be the one that says we need to include these 10 things. And Claire is great about asking questions. Tell me how they tell the different story. Could we use this instead of these 3 things, this one thing? And so it's be prepared to, especially in the beginning when you're starting out on this project, give plenty of time for iterations back and forth and lots of pairs of eyes on it. Like Claire mentioned, from the right brain, left brain, and then also someone who's not involved in the project. If you've got a great proofreader or just someone who is maybe on staff in your organization or one of the collaborating organizations to read through and to proofread, not only for details, but to make sure you're telling the story that makes sense or is valuable to the audience who's never been on the other side, on the inside, where you're diving into the data and iterations back and forth on what stories tell, that kind of thing.
You know, Jacki touched on earlier about the importance of consistency and being able to look year over year, or at least trend of years, for the same indicators, the same data set. Consistency is absolutely key, but I would say don't let consistency block your ability to adapt and be flexible, because certainly the COVID pandemic changed a lot of what data was available, when it was available, how the economy itself was changing during that time. And it requires each of us to be nimble and flexible in what we're trying to convey and communicate. And I'm still learning. I mean, 10 years later, working together on this and other projects, even yesterday, Jacki was teaching me, we were talking about employment growth, and there was a line chart by sectors. And I was saying, why are these in this particular order? And it was by NAICS code. Well, we're not showing the NAICS code. Nobody outside of data geeks is necessarily knowing a NAICS code. And I said, can we flip the legend so it's in order how the lines in the graph are based on the employment sector? So to me, logically, that makes sense that if the blue line is at the top and that's our largest employment sector, which is manufacturing, then the legend should track the orders of them. And
It was painful for me.
Yes, it looks strange to her. So that's that type of back and forth of what are the rules, what is the structure, and how far can we push it or break it or alter it to still tell an accurate story, but make sure that it makes sense to the different audiences that are ultimately going to be viewing this and looking at it.
Great point.
Two things that we're looking at now as we continue to evolve the scorecard is a printed copy as well as an electronic copy the right tool for the right time? Do we need to be looking more at a digital dashboard? We know that there are some members of the community that like having a hard copy. They like having it in their offices to flip to and refer to or have in place. But increasingly, you can get more deeper into the data if we're using some type of interactive format. We haven't cracked the code on that yet. I think we're at a tipping point as society for moving more towards that direction, and it may be more of a generational shift. So that's one thing for communities to think about. And what was my second point?
I don't know.
Oh, got it. I think the other thing that we're struggling with is that the data does not change that much from year to year. And that's one of the things that Jacki has cautioned me is we are showing trend data benchmark to 2005. This isn't meant to be year over year. So that's a communication challenge for us to make sure that the audience is interpreting it accordingly. But it's also a production challenge of if the data isn't changing that much, how do you continue to keep the story fresh? How do you make it compelling for the decision makers we want to act on it? So one of the things that we're looking at is, do we go alternate years in producing the report?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.